So let's talk about 9 Warhammer 40k units that won pretty big in the last balance update, getting rules and points buffs that make them look fairly scary on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking improved units, taking a look at some of the highlights of the balance update, and this time just focusing on a few units individually that really seem to have got quite a lot better. Either things that were already good for their armies that now look standout, or things that have risen up in quite a big way, maybe being a bit more middling before, but being buffed more than you might expect. Jumping straight into it, and first up we have Vashtorr the Archifane, Games Workshop's fairly new creation in the Demigod of the Forge, having a starring role in the Arcs of Omen sequence, but unfortunately having really quite underwhelming rules on the tabletop since his miniature came out, which is kind of a shame as it's a pretty fun, disturbing techno demon. I felt like for his current rules in Codex Chaos Space Marines, he was perhaps usable casually, but very rarely seems to crop up in strong lists. He's basically 175 points for a fairly tough monster unit with some anti-vehicle rules, but maybe didn't tend to have quite so reliable an impact as you might hope for a demigod avatar of chaos, or compared with the other things that you could get for the same points cost. His rules really changed in a very big way though, with buffs across the board, and making him both far more dangerous, better buffing abilities, and harder to kill. He gained a lone operative ability when he's within 3 inches of a demon engine, which is pretty big and very disruptive for such a big tough model in the first place. Provided there are other demon vehicles in the list, the opponent's not going to be able to whittle away at his fairly chunky stats with their heavy weapons before he gets close, and definitely a strong incentive to have at least some other demon engines to run with him. Talking of those though, his buff to demon vehicles makes that significantly better. Previously he had an aura of giving them +1 strength at range and melee, but now it's been upgraded to +2 strength. I feel like that's just far more likely to make an impact in terms of actually tipping the +1 to wound, with 40k's strength and toughness chart being stretched out compared with 9th edition. +1 strength just really isn't what it was. It could be interesting for Forge Fiends though to get them up to strength 12, which is a pretty nice breakpoint against a bunch of heavy tanks, or make Venom Crawlers and their mass AP 1 damage 2 fire go from strength 6 to strength 8. And again, that seems a lot more punchy and general purpose, both against the toughest stuff and wounding Space Marines and things on 2s. Then, even outside of the lone operative reorder reality, his other special rule was buffed big. Now he's literally always a -1 to hit within 18-inch range, and that's both range and melee. Previously it just gave you the hazardous keyword when he was attacked at range, though it now seems that both range and melee will trigger that, so it's going to be an extra painful model to try and destroy at close range. Your weapon's damage isn't going to go quite as far as you might hope it might be, and a good bunch of your models might even be slain due to their own hazardous rolls, which definitely helps out with him trading out in a positive sort of way after any damage he might have done in his own turn. With his chance to get lone operative, there's a lot more chance that you might be attacking him within 18 inches as well, needing to get close to be able to damage him in the first place if he's supported. So again, it does feel kind of brutal for enemy units to get close to shoot or charge him, and then also be -1 to hit against a good defensive profile, and lose a bunch of the squad just due to hazardous rolls, never mind any strike backs that Vashtorr does. Then finally, as if that weren't enough, he's also got a big boost in melee profile as well. His main hammer attacks gain AP -3, and it's really quite general purpose now, either 12 attacks at strength 8, AP 1 -2 with devastating wounds, or 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 3 now, again with the anti-vehicle and devastating wounds keywords. Interestingly, it looks like against some high and vulnerable save vehicles you might actually be better striking with the sweep profile against them now, due to having double the attacks and still equally getting devastating wounds on a 4+ with them. Either way, he's going to be far better at clearing out standard Space Marines or things with high armor saves. Overall, between all this, he looks very much improved. Very tempting to include between all that for 175 points, I think. Likely alongside some Demon Engine fire supports to buff with his +2 strength and give him some cover to help him get close to get that melee profile to work, and when the enemy tries to deal with him to cause them damage. Next up, and sticking with some technological terrors, there's the Technomancer Wraiths for the Necrons. These ones felt like quite a surprise to get a points cut really. They're already really quite a popular unit in competitive lists, usually taken as a big block of 6 Wraiths for a bunch of toughness 6 4 wound models with a 4+ invulnerable save, and then a Technomancer alongside giving them a 5+ feel no pain, and helping heal models as well, along with reanimation protocols. Between all those stats together, it meant that the vast majority of weapons just aren't really very effective against killing them. Very little is going to one-shot a model if they even fail the invulnerable save in the first place, and then you've got fairly tanky wounds that regrow at a slightly alarming rate if you half kill the unit and fall short. Some of the detachments have extra options for reanimating as well, such as Starshatter Arsenal and Awakened Dynasty, never mind if there's a Canoptek Reanimator nearby to help them out further. And they're a standout unit in Canoptek Court with all the stratagem support and the ability to infiltrate as well. Their damage output isn't exactly their biggest strong suit, but they're going to have at least a fair bit of threat with strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 melee to bully medium units, and particle casters for a few more devastating wounds on top of that. And all of their detachments are going to give them some extra damage buffs as well, whether it's leaders for Awakened, objectives for Star Shatter, or rerolls for Canoptek Court. Overall seems that they were already considered adequately strong and commonly played in competitive lists. Definitely a problem unit for the opponent, and a good option for some big stratagems on. Now though, it looks like the squad with the Technomancer has dropped down from 315 points to 300 points before any enhancements you might give them. So not exactly the most enormous points cut in the world, but it's a 5% cut on a unit that was already good, and that feels like it's only going to encourage yet more use of them. Seems like it maybe pushes them further towards auto-include status, as opposed to just merely being very good. Before we move on to the other units, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Tech. They're makers of the Meki series of carry cases, a set of cases that do things quite differently, shipping out from Australia, and links down in the video description. The Meki case's big idea is to use these sort of simple machinery components to hold miniatures in place. The main idea being that you can customize the carry cases to have different modules depending on your army, and then they basically have a variety of different mechanisms to grip onto the miniature bases, squad size ones that can hold entire units at a time, simple miniature ones with spring-loaded grippers, or little clips that can go around the edge of bigger miniatures. For their case options, they've got the choice of these slider cases here, with the focus mainly being on maximal model storage. Their primary offering though is these slider case frames, where there's lots of different options to choose from, set up for different miniatures of different heights and different balances of display versus storage depending on the windows out the front and the shelves included. The 6 size one might be good for standard size combat patrols, they can be configured to fit them. And they go all the way up to these enormous army size ones, the big 24 size ones having a good chance to hold the majority of 2,000 point army lists. Here's a few of my own miniatures hanging out in one. For advice on the setup, they've got a web chat service on their web store link below. They can advise on the best combos of cases and modules. And they've got plenty of other case options, including this Duncan Rhodes hobby case, recently winning a best hobby case award. In any case though, if you want to check out their range, their link's down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Getting back to the 40k units though, and next up we have the Thunderwolf Cavalry. The Space Wolves got their Codex points released in the balance update, and fitting with Games Workshop's content creator ones that they've released. It does indeed look like Thunderwolf Cavalry are priced incredibly efficiently, 100 points for 3 of them, or 220 points for 6. The Thunderwolf units have definitely changed in nature. Previously people tended to use both Wolfguard Battle Leaders and Wolfguards just to make a super fighty unit that's going to take massive chunks out of everything that it touched, and had a whole bunch of different buffing rules from free stratagems to reactive moves, where now all those leaders are sent to legends, and the datasheet has to carry its own weight a bit more. The rules have certainly seen some overall big buffs though. For a small squad of 3 of them, they're just looking incredibly efficient, 100 points per 3 of them, so a big 17% points decrease there, which is super meaningful. And the big squad is also cheaper than it used to be. Both of those are very solid on the durability front already. They're toughness 6 models with 4 wounds, a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, so that's certainly very chunky and hard to take down for essentially 33 or 36 points per model. They move faster built in now, like the majority of Space Wolves, so you have a movement of 12, which will be nice for running them around terrain. In the Stormlance Task Force, they've still got ridiculously enormous threat range, particularly if you go for the big 2 command point stratagem with them. Though perhaps most impressively, in the context of the points cut, their melee damage seems to have got scarier. The base Wolfguard with their weapons now have 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, which, considering that they were AP 1 and damage 1, just makes them far more threatening both to standard Space Marines, heavy infantry and tougher stuff, and it's still backed up by their Thunderwolf jaw attacks and the extra damage that they get on the charge, pushing that Blade Guard style melee profile up to damage 3. They can certainly get a fair few good benefits from the new detachments as well. Feels like the Beast Slayer one might be a nice one to round them out and just get them lethal hits. They're already going to be really quite effective against the vast majority of infantry units, so having them punch solidly harder against tougher stuff seems like a real win there. Will be interesting to see how people make use of them in Space Wolf lists. It just looks like they're kind of hard to pass up for the sheer stats they get on the table though. 33 points per model for this combination of speed, damage and durability seems like a real win. And even if there's a points premium, the squads of 6 still seem very interesting as well, being more efficient for stratagems and maybe doing more to reach the sort of critical mass of melee that you need to engage some targets. Next up we've got the Sanguinary Guard, and I feel like if there had to be one single biggest winner out of the entire balance update, it's probably them. They'd already got a previous points cut down to 130 points at the previous balance update, and that had already put them in a place where the vast majority of Blood Angels lists tended to use at least some of them. They seem to be quite viable in a number of different ways, either big 6 model squads with Dante, or small squads of 3 going it alone. Fast moving jump troops that have general purpose damage that, while they're best against elite infantry, could punch up against stuff with buffs and aren't trivial to take down with a 2+ save, 3 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, even if durability isn't their standout thing. given that I already would have considered them absolutely top tier for Blood Angels. The smaller size squad dropping down to 110 points from 130, so a massive 20 points or 16% decrease, just seems kind of crazy really. At that sort of points cost, I can't see why you'd not take 3 units of them. They're just going to be units that are almost guarantees to trade out favourably with the opponents, particularly with the damage buffs or support options from the Blood Angels' good detachments. The Liberator maybe being better for small unit efficiency, as you don't need characters to lead them. The big squad also dropped as well, 240 points per 6 rather than 260, and Dante and the Jump Captain both got 10 point decreases too. Both of those were already used as well, so it's definitely a case of strong stuff getting stronger. The big 6-man squad with Dante dropped down to 360. That still seems excellent in that format, and you could have smaller units as well with Jump Captains in Angelic Inheritors. Pretty scary to think that they could be 185 points for 3 Sanguinary Guard and a Jump Captain if you wanted to. This just looks like it's going to add a massive amount of direct strength to Blood Angels. In a stronger list, I just don't see why you wouldn't start with 3 units of 3 of them, and then have the decision as to whether any of those squads either want characters or expanding to the 6-man units. It just seems basically impossible to go too far wrong with them now. Next up, we've got the Dark Angels, and Lionel Johnson remains at 315 points. The Primarch leader of the army, bringing fights first with some fairly massive melee threat, and that's on a hard-to-kill model that gets lone operative near-friendly infantry, with a 3+ invulnerable save for the Emperor's Shield. His damage output has 8 attacks at strength 12, AP 4 and damage 4 with lethal hits, or 16 attacks on a sweep profile with sustained hits if he needs to chew through some Space Marines. And given that he has fights first, that just makes him an incredibly problematic unit for a bunch of enemies to deal with. Medium-sized units that are relying on melee damage to take him out are really going to have a hard time, and he can be big with heroic intervention as well, potentially supporting friendly units nearby, or even comboing it with rapid ingress out of Deep Strike as talked about in the last video. It seemed that he was in a fairly well balanced place within Dark Angels lists previously, where I did a big review of lists that had placed well. It seemed that something around about a third of lists chose to use him, so absolutely playable. Though nowhere near as auto-include as, say, Azrael or the Deathwing Knights. I feel like there was still some sense that people wanted the line to be more impactful on the tabletop. He was mentioned a lot when I did a video on units people wanted to see improved. There's still maybe a surprise that Games Workshop gave him quite so many buffs without altering his points cost at all, and lots of those buffs seem really quite meaningful. First up, he's gained the option to return to Strategic Reserve, doing a bit of forest walking around the table as per his new lore. I feel like most of the time that'll be something that you don't really want to do, as you want as many turns with him being impactful on the tabletop as you can. But if he really does wind up being out of position, maybe after achieving his target and slaying an enemy, there's really nothing too meaningful that he's going to be able to do from his current board position, it could well be the best thing to go for. Destroy the enemy, go back into reserves, and then maybe attempt a 9-inch charge with a reroll, or I guess potentially sit a turn off the board and rapid ingress, if that's going to more reliably give him value. If he's not doing that though, his melee damage buff got far better. Previously he gave you an aura of +1 to hit in melee, which wasn't useful to him, and wasn't useful for Deathwing Knights either, both of those already hitting on a 2+. And wasn't reliably good for Inner Circle companions either, as they could also potentially get that. Now instead he gives you an aura of reroll 1s to hit and wound in melee, which seems just excellent for him with his big scary profiles, and also adds 2 Deathwing Knights, and given hitting on 2+, it might mean that you can use Oath of Moment in a different place, as opposed to buffing his own damage if that's the single most important thing to happen. That's certainly not a small thing on his melee damage though, and that makes him meaningfully more scary. You'd expect most of the time his attacks are going to be hitting and wounding. Finally, he also got an extra durability buff as well, the Emperor's Shield making him -1 to wound against things with strength 11 or higher. Definitely far more powerful than the bounce back mortal wound rule that he had before. That seemed probably like the sort of change that they should have made in the codex anyway. There'd still be people who'd really quite like him to have the Deathwing keyword for all the synergies that could bring, though maybe that's a deliberate choice on Games Workshop's part. Either way, it's looking like he's moved from being usable for the Dark Angels to outright a massive source of strength, warping around the board when it makes sense, and potentially being able to do so after you've seen secondary objectives and things is a pretty big choice. And if not using that or his mortal wound protection, he's going to be hitting far harder in combat than he used to. Next up, for a more straightforward improvement, we've got the Allarus Custodians. They're the big and chunky Custodian Terminators, toughness 7 and 4 wounds, so fairly hard to take down on an individual model basis. A bunch of blast shots with those grenade launchers, adding to their small arms capability compared with some of their other rivals. And then they get 2 good data sheet special rules, reroll wounds against characters, monsters and vehicles, which is nice for those general purpose Guardian Spears, and a once per game teleport maneuver, returning to reserves and then warping onto the board again, which could have the potential for turn 1 teleports if desired, if the opponent goes first and then you return them to reserves at the end of your turn. They definitely have some interesting abilities and good damage output. They were used at least fairly often in competitive lists, though generally in small numbers as a supporting role, as opposed to being the mainstay of the army, actually giving and receiving blows. That often tends to fall to the Wardens and the Blade Champion. They tended to be more standout for the Lines of the Emperor though. They've got good things for Terminator Shield Captains, and a fun stratagem to be able to split the squad into individual units if you'd like to, which if done early could mean that you could be throwing around individual Terminators with their return to reserves rule, which is quite a nice cheap deep striker option that still got a fair amount of threat, but could be useful for doing secondary objectives or being a nuisance. They got a pretty solid points cut though, dropping down to 60 points from 65, so a minus 8% drop there. I feel like that's respectable enough to be felt, and particularly for a unit that was already seeing play. A bunch of Lines of the Emperor list might drop a good 25 points or so straight out, and there'll be temptation to use a few more of them if they are more efficient. Feels like after the change they're going to be far more in line with the other Custodians units that you've got as options for the other detachments, and probably still slightly more standout for the Lions. For another example of a pretty solid unit that got better, we've got the Sword Brethren and Helbrecht of the Black Templars. They've certainly been a really interesting unit stats-wise, and just masses and masses of damage previously, though it seems that Privileged Games Workshop have gradually cranked up the points cost, so they're just a bit on the underwhelming side, likely to go in, destroy something utterly, and then get destroyed in return. The Sword Brethren profiles, while they're using their +1 damage special rule, get a whole bunch of damage 2 or damage 3 weapons, and then Helbrechts joining them both gives them +1 strength to all those weapons, and 5+ critical hits that could either combo nicely with a Castellan in the unit, or using the buffs from Righteous Crusaders, getting you some sustained or lethal hits either from the core rule or with the stratagem. Between the two of them, and maybe using Oath of Moment to maximise those critical hits, even with 5 of them, they're a fairly terrifying force that can threaten to solo the majority of targets in the game. Helbrecht's own damage profile, adding a whole bunch of mortal wounds, and then really enjoying that +1 damage buff that the Sword Brethren give him, so his attacks either hit with damage 4 or damage 2 on the sweep mode. Perhaps the biggest problem for them is often getting that damage output into the right targets, usually wanting to pay for something to get them into battle safely, perhaps a Templar Impulsor, and then perhaps having the prospect of charging something and destroying it, and then maybe getting taken out in return. Either way though, there was still a very popular threat to have in Templar lists, and I've got far more interesting. Sword Brethren went down to 140 points or 270 for the big squad. I feel like that's fair enough given that the small squad tends to be the more useful. I feel like sheer damage just isn't really their problem, so it probably makes more sense that the small squad costs more. And then Helbrecht drops down from 130 points to 120, meaning that 5 with Helbrecht now goes down to 260 points, so an overall 7% drop on that combo. I feel like overall that's enough of a decrease to make them a genuine source of strength for the Templars, as opposed to just one option that might be a little bit better than most. I think they're still probably going to have that same problem of maybe threatening overkill and then not being so tough to the counter-attack, but getting their enormous damage for less. I think it's going to be adequately tempting that most Templar players will take this unit now. Next up, and back to the Sons of Sanguinius once more, we've got the Lord of Death. Another surprisingly generous decrease for them was Mephiston dropping down to 120 points. Even cheaper than his Codex launch points. When I made a tier list for them, he was 125 then, I think. I was being considered as one of the more auto-include units in the Codex at that point. For 120 points, he just brings a pretty immense amount of utility and threat. Lone operatives in 40k are just handy to have in the first place, units that you can't interact with at long range, so can screen out bits of the board, do secondary objectives, or maybe occasionally even hold primaries in peace. So if you've got one that can then counter-attack in a huge way, then it's a big win. Even if you get close enough to attack him, Mephiston's still got a massive defense profile as well. 6 wounds at toughness 5 with a 2+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, though a big 4+ feel no pain. And that basically means that you're going to, on average, have to chew through 12 wounds at that profile. Never mind any other defensive buffs you might get for him, such as a timely use of Armour of Contempt. He's fairly fast to get around the board. He moves 7 inches and can advance and charge if that's going to be needed. He does have a little bit of significant shooting as well that might more a marine equivalent or two. Then his melee, while it's not usually going to be soloing battle tanks or wiping out entire squads, it's going to take a chunk out of most things in the game. 6 attacks at strength 9, AP 3 and damage D3, all with lethal hits. That's before any detachment buffs or stratagems from Liberator or Angelic Inheritors. All of that melee has fights first as well, so a lot of enemy units are going to have to be wary about just charging him in case he kills half the squad before they get to strike. It's also got a chance to lock enemies in melee as well. He was already being used in a good chunk of Strongblood Angels lists already. Certainly not auto-include at 135 points, though he wasn't passed up entirely. He was maybe being rivalled for the Sanguinary for a very similar role. I probably would have been slightly on the side of the Sanguinary over him previously, but given this fairly enormous points decrease down to 120 points from 135, I feel like Mephiston gains the upper hand once again. Overall feels like another solid win for the Blood Angels. At 120 points I feel like he goes from merely usable to standout strong, and possibly the preferred one over the Sanguinary, though I guess you could still take both if you wanted for maximal lone operative fighty disruption. Next up for improved units, worth shouting out the Chaos Space Marines Lord Discordant. Hopefully they've done enough to make him into a good unit, though he was coming from a place of weakness, 160 points and basically unplayed before despite that points cut, having a bunch of issues with the datasheet. He's a little bit on the fragile side still, with a character at toughness 9 and 10 wounds. He had a 2+ save and now he's gained a 4+ invulnerable save as well. Still for 160 points, I don't think that's stand out on the durability front, though it's still not awful. He gets a Bale Flamer to clear out some Space Marines or lighter infantry, and then some fairly general purpose melee. The Impaler Chainglaive getting a massive buff here, a Lance profile with 5 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3, making him way more threatening, plus a bunch of bladed limbs from the Hellstalker, and then either a Magma Cutter or Technovirus Injector for a little bit of extra damage. It's going to be a lot easier to get into melee now, going from movement 10 to a big movement 14, which might actually be enough to get him around a ruin and into melee with things. That big base might still be a challenge on that regard though, and while his debuffs are very much locked to harming enemy vehicles, at least they're better, changing from a weird shooting debuff to some direct mortal wound damage, and marking one target for extra damage from your whole Chaos Marine army anywhere within visible range and not super close anymore. I'm genuinely interested as to whether or not people choose to put him on the table with all these buffs. I feel like any big fighty character could be interesting enough for enhancements, though for Chaos Space Marines most people would have gone for Demon Princes before. Anything that could give a 5+ feel no pain, or other survivability boosts or interesting shenanigans could be really nice on him. I still guess it's probably going to be kind of merely okay against the majority of armies, just really coming into his own against vehicle ones, so perhaps depends on how often you're running into things like knights or other vehicle spam armies in the meta, whether it's on the competitive scene or people you might be playing locally. That's maybe it for the main unit list, that may be worth a few more honourable mentions. I feel like with the Sisters of Battle units that both got points cuts and rules buffs, a lot of stuff saw small solid improvements. I'm not sure if there's any one that I'd pick out as enormously more than the rest though. Castigators, Immolators and Paragon Warsuits were all great before on staples of strong lists, so small points cuts to them it definitely helps out directly. Seraphim got cheaper and Zephyrim got a nastier melee without having to sacrifice miracle dice, and Retributors might be one of the most improved datasheets out there, both dropping 10 points and getting a far more punchy damage rule out of it, but they felt like there were units that was really quite a long way behind previous to that, so perhaps sort of feels more like a bad unit actually catching up with the rest a fair bit, as opposed to being standout great. For this one I've chosen not to talk about units that more stayed the same, but Death Guard units like the Feated Bloat Drone with the Heavy Blight Launcher, the Death Shroud Terminators, and maybe some of the Plague Marine combo characters, they all feel like winners by default from remaining untouched. And perhaps for just another couple of picks for interesting units that got points cuts, Scorpius tanks were already great for the AdMech and dropped in cost. The Castellans getting Doctriners inbuilt is another big win for them, maybe we'll see a few more. And the Tyranids Hyper-Adaptive Raveners seem pretty interesting in general purpose damage output with their anti-keywords and free rapid ingress things. Let me know your thoughts on the units though, which are the ones that you'd consider to be some of the absolute standout ones for their armies after the balance update. Look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments below, and anything else interesting I might have missed about the ones talked about in this video of course. A big thank you to Tabletop Tech for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out their web store linked down in the video description if you would like to check out their unique take on miniature carry cases. Their website chat thing can give you a bit of advice if you want some guidance on specific combos of cases for any given army, and if you do pick up anything at all, there's a discount code for Auspex for 10% off, so be sure to use that if you're picking up any cases or modules. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, then feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support. There's a few benefits there, such as seeing occasional videos early and entry into the monthly prize giveaways. But in any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.